Hello, everyone. Welcome to Exploring with Scientists, How Do Some Frogs Avoid Extinction? Today, this is part 4 of our 4-part series, our last session, and we're going to be working in the lab. So we have this question, right? How do some frogs avoid extinction? Another question that's related, how have some frogs survived with this new disease? We've gone to the field to answer this question to collect samples. Now we have to process them to get the certain information we want to answer this question. So if we're in the field, collected these samples, we have to go back to the lab to where we work. So I have to travel from Ecuador back to Michigan. This is where we do the kind of things that you might think of a scientist doing in a movie or a TV show, where we're wearing lab coats, we're working in sterile environments, where we're using different chemicals and doing different things to extract the key information that we want in the samples that we have. And in our samples, what we are interested in to answer our question is DNA. So DNA is a molecule that determines your traits, kind of like a blueprint to building a house or a recipe to cooking a meal. And so we have different DNA that determines traits like your hair color, your eye color, or your height. And these portions of your DNA that determine your different traits are called genes. So for example, we all have genes that determine our eye color, but we can have different versions of those genes. So some people have versions that give them blue eyes, some have brown eyes, and some have green eyes. So they're all the same version of the gene, or they're all the same kind of gene that does the same thing, but you can have different versions that creates variation in that trait, like eye color. Frogs have the same thing, and they do, much more than just determine color. They determine all kinds of things. So for example, some genes can help frogs defend themselves against diseases. So different individuals have different versions, just like in our eye color example. So here, if we assume that in this example, that the DNA, the gene that is involved here, or multiple genes, determines their ability to defend themselves against disease, then we have all these different colors that determine, that allow different individuals to have different defenses. So some could be really good at defending and some could be really bad at defending, just based on the certain gene and disease involved. One thing, so we have these genes, right? And we have these different versions or diversity of variations of them, and we call that genetic diversity. And frogs need this variation. We need frog populations to have lots of these different versions to respond to different changes in the environment. So let's get really specific. We've talked to, these are kind of some big concepts. Let's cover one specific example of the question that I'm talking about to try and help us learn more about this and walk through an example. So on the left here, we have a healthy frog population, right? This is a population that has multiple individuals, a lot of individuals of frogs with a lot of different variation. So remember, in our examples here, the color represents just a different version of the same gene. And we're going to talk about how the genes that are involved in fighting chytrid fungus. So on the left is our starting point with our healthy population. We introduce chytrid fungus, right? Chytrid fungus arrives in the new environment. And the colors here for chytrid fungus represent the versions of genes that chytrid fungus is really good at infecting. So because the chytrid fungus has the warmer colors, the reds, the yellows, and the purples, those frogs are going to get infected really easily and they won't survive. But chytrid fungus isn't good at targeting and infecting the frogs with the blue and green, the cooler colored genes. And so in the end, frogs survive, right? The chytrid fungus infects the ones that it's good at infecting, but because there's lots of variation in different versions of those genes, some frogs will make it. So this is a good situation. This is what we want. It's frogs to make it after there's a big change in their environment, like a new disease. Let's imagine another example, the same situation, the same color scheme and everything. But before chytrid fungus arrives, the population isn't healthy, right? Let's say there are other changes like habitat loss. We cut too much of their forest down, or we polluted too much of their forests, or there was climate change happening. And so what the normal healthy population was already kind of shrunk down to a smaller size, and therefore there's not as much versions of genes because there's not as many individuals to carry them. And by chance, it was the first three. So the green, the blue, and the purple versions of the genes aren't in the environment anymore. Now the chytrid fungus arrives just like last time, and remember that it's good at infecting the warmer colors that are signified here, the red, the yellow, and the purple. The same thing will happen. The red and the yellow frogs won't make it because they will be infected very easily. And because there's not other versions of genes, this is when extinction happens. This is when all frogs are gone forever because there's not enough variation to respond to quick changes that happen in the environment. Another way frogs can fight the disease is through something we call the skin microbiome. Microbiome is this relationship that animals have with microorganisms. Humans have microbiomes. You might have heard that special kind of bacteria and things live inside your gut, and they help you break down food and get nutrients. You have special microbes that live on your skin and help it from kind of eat all the dead skin away. We have microbes that live all over us and do these different functions, and we can't see them, but they help us in a lot of ways. Frogs have a special skin microbiome that actually helps them defend against diseases. And so the chytrid fungus is a fungus, and certain bacteria are called antifungal bacteria. And so if frogs have those bacteria that live on their skin, what that means is when the chytrid fungus arrives, because they're antifungal, that means they'll fight and be able to kill any fungus that arrives. And so in this example, same as our other examples, right? The chytrid fungus arrives, it's good at infecting the frogs that have the warmer colored DNA. Just like last time, the blues and greens aren't infected, so they make it because they're not infected as easily with chytrid fungus. And also the red doesn't make it because that's the version of the gene that's very easily infected. But we can have something else happen where, although the chytrid fungus is good at infecting the frogs, the purple and yellow and the red that have that version of gene, if they also have these special microbes that live on their skin, this can kind of act like having the blue and green versions of the genes, to where maybe in the blue and green versions of the genes, what's happening is they're producing something in their skin. It's actually the frog that's fighting and defending itself against the fungus. But instead of that happening, if they can't do that, they can kind of recruit microbes and work as a team, and the microbes can live on their skin and fight the fungus for them. And then the microbes will get a home living on their skin. And so that relationship can actually help more versions of the genes that aren't very good at defending against the chytrid fungus. Those frogs can still make it. And so we have another example of where frogs can have relationships with other organisms like microbes that help them defend against diseases. So how can frogs avoid extinction? Two ways here with fighting the chytrid fungus is having lots of genetic diversity and relationships with beneficial microbes. And how can we ensure this happens, right? Because this is a really good example of one change, like one disease, but we don't actually know what versions of genes are important. So maybe in this example, the green and the blue, remember, were the ones that were good at surviving with the chytrid fungus, but maybe in the future, warming temperatures and climate change, the frogs that are really good at surviving at warmer temperatures are a different version. They're the ones that have the red and the yellow genes, versions of genes. And so because we don't understand yet before a change happens, which ones are important, the goal that we want to do as conservation biologists is preserve as much variation as possible. We want to keep these populations as happy and healthy as they can be, so that way when changes do happen, they have the things that they need, the versions of genes, the key relationships that help them to respond to that change as best they can. So if we're talking about genetic diversity, how can we help them preserve this genetic diversity? The biggest thing we can do is protect frog habitats. So in order for them to have lots of variation, they need to have a habitat to have that many individuals. So that's the number one thing we can do, is protect frog habitats. We can also do research to figure out what kind of genetic diversity frogs need. So for example, in the example that we went through, the blue and green, right? We knew that those versions of genes were good at defending against the chytrid fungus. But before we can know that, we have to do research, right? Scientists had to figure that out to understand which ones are important. And if we do that, we can use that research to help them in the wild. So one way that we're doing this, these are two frogs again, that I've showed you before that we're working with. And these are frogs that were in that low population example, right? When we cut down too much of their forests, and they were in danger of being wiped out completely. And so some scientists took them in before they could get wiped out. And this is me in a big outdoor aquarium where they're actually, some of them are housed, and I'm testing for the disease, and we're doing different things working with the scientists here. What we're doing is breeding them in a certain way to increase genetic diversity. So this is one way. If we know what genes are important in persisting with the disease, we can cross individuals in a certain way that increases the variation of those genes and versions of genes in the population. And then we can reintroduce them so that the population is better able to handle that change and live in the wild. So this is one way that, doing our research and answering the question, we can use that information to help benefit the frogs that we're working on. So I hope you had fun and actually finally answered the question, how do some frogs avoid extinction? What we can do as people to help this is protect frog habitats. We want to protect the habitats and therefore the population, the size that populations and groups of frogs can grow to. And we want to continue doing research to try and understand what frogs need to persist with changes to be able to help them. So thanks for joining me. Take care.